I'm 81 years old now, and money changes the way you understand your life, especially when you finally have enough of it. It doesn't give clarity the way people promise. It doesn't line your memories into success and failure. Instead, it reveals something quieter and harder to accept, what it never protected you from. When I was younger, I believed money was insulation, not luxury safety. I didn't dream of excess. I dreamed of relief. I wanted enough so that life wouldn't feel so sharp, so demanding, so fragile. I believed that once I reached a certain number, a certain stability, the deeper worries would soften on their own. That belief felt reasonable, responsible, even wise. I worked hard, I planned carefully, I delayed gratification, I learned how to think long term. I wasn't reckless, and I wasn't greedy. I just didn't want to be vulnerable. I didn't want to feel exposed to the randomness of life the way I had when I was young. Money, I thought, would close that gap. So I built my life around it, not obsessively, but faithfully. I made choices that prioritized security. I chose paths that were steady over those that were meaningful. I told myself fulfillment could come later, once the foundation was solid. I didn't realize that later was doing most of the work in that sentence. In my 30s and 40s, things looked good from the outside. I was stable. I was advancing. I was careful. I paid my bills early. I avoided unnecessary risks. I was proud of how little I worried about money compared to others. That pride felt earned. What I didn't notice was how often I was using money as a reason to postpone living fully. If something stirred discomfort, I told myself it was temporary, that security would make it easier to face later. If something felt missing, I assumed it would resolve itself once I was more established. I translated emotional questions into financial goals. If I earned a bit more, saved a bit more, planned a bit better, I believed the rest would fall into place. And because nothing collapsed right away, I assumed I was right. That's the danger of this belief. Money works just well enough to keep you from noticing what it can't touch. I wasn't unhappy, that's important to say. I felt capable, grounded, protected. I slept well, knowing emergencies wouldn't ruin me. I measured my progress in accounts and forecasts, not realizing I was slowly narrowing the way I measured my life. I began to confuse safety with satisfaction. There were moments, quiet ones, when I sensed something was off. Sitting alone after a long day, looking at what I had built and feeling strangely untouched by it. I told myself that was normal. That contentment was calm, not emotional. That intensity was for people who hadn't yet stabilized their lives. Money gave me control, and control felt like peace. But control also gave me distance from uncertainty, from longing, from parts of myself that didn't have a price tag. I didn't notice how rarely I asked what I actually wanted. I focused on what made sense, on what would last, on what would protect me. If I were young again, I'd understand how easily money becomes a substitute for attention, how planning replaces presence, how security can quietly crowd out curiosity. I believed I was building a life that would eventually feel complete. I didn't realize that while I was protecting myself from loss, I was also protecting myself from depth. And because money did exactly what it promised, kept things stable, I had no reason to question what it was silently failing to provide. That realization would come later, much later, after the numbers stopped being the problem. After the numbers stopped being the problem, I expected something else to take their place. A feeling, a sense of arrival, some quiet confirmation that all the careful planning had led me somewhere solid inside myself. That's what I thought security was supposed to deliver. Not happiness exactly, but ease, a softening, a sense that I could finally exhale. Instead, life simply continued. The bills were paid. The future was accounted for. The margin for error was wide enough that surprises no longer scared me. And yet, nothing inside me shifted the way I had imagined it would. The anxiety faded, yes, but it didn't transform into fulfillment. It just left a kind of emotional silence behind. I told myself that was peace. I had everything I once said I needed to feel safe, and still something remained unresolved. I didn't panic about it. I didn't name it. I treated it the same way I had treated so many other uncomfortable feelings over the years, with logic. I told myself that wanting more once you had enough was ungrateful. That dissatisfaction was a failure of perspective, not a signal worth listening to. So I ignored it. Money had done its job well. It had removed urgency. It had softened fear. It had given me options. What it hadn't done was teach me how to sit with myself once there was nothing left to fix. I wasn't used to that kind of stillness. My entire adult life had been organized around preparation, saving for something, securing something, planning for something else. When that preparation was no longer necessary, I didn't know what to replace it with. I stayed busy in quieter ways, managing, maintaining, optimizing. I kept my life efficient and predictable. I told myself I was enjoying the fruits of my labor, and in some ways, I was. There was comfort in knowing that money would not be the thing that broke me. But comfort has a way of dulling questions instead of answering them. I noticed that my days felt lighter, but not richer. They passed easily, but left little behind. I didn't wake up dreading anything, but I also didn't wake up eager. Everything felt handled. And being handled became the goal. If I were young again, I'd understand how dangerous it is to live only for what removes discomfort. Because once discomfort is gone, you're left alone with yourself. And if you've never practiced listening, that silence feels empty. I began to measure my life by how smoothly it ran. No emergencies, no surprises, no disruptions. I took pride in that stability. I told myself that chaos was for people who hadn't planned well. That uncertainty was a failure of discipline. I didn't realize that some parts of life only appear when you allow space for them. Money gave me space, but I filled it immediately with routines, with maintenance, with small tasks that made the days feel purposeful without asking anything deeper of me. I had learned how to be secure. I had not learned how to be present. There were moments, small ones again, when I caught myself wondering what all this stability was for, not in a dramatic way, just a passing thought. A quiet question that surfaced and disappeared before I could hold on to it. I dismissed it quickly. I told myself that questioning a good life was foolish, that many people would trade places with me without hesitation, and they would have been right. But comparison has a way of silencing truths that don't fit neatly into gratitude. I had built a life that was hard to criticize and easy to justify. That made it almost impossible to examine honestly. Nothing was wrong enough to fix, nothing hurt enough to demand attention. So I assumed this mild emotional flatness was simply the cost of stability. I didn't yet understand that money hadn't failed me. It had simply done only what it was capable of doing. It had protected my future, but it had never promised to fill my present. That understanding didn't arrive all at once. It took years. Years of calm days that passed without depth. Years of telling myself this was what success felt like. Years of mistaking the absence of fear for the presence of meaning. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to sense that what I had protected myself from wasn't just loss. It was feeling fully alive. That realization would deepen with time, and when it did, money would be no help at all. When I finally admitted to myself that something was missing, I didn't know what to do with that awareness. I had spent most of my life believing that problems existed to be solved, that if something felt off, there must be a practical adjustment that would correct it. But this wasn't that kind of problem. There was nothing to optimize, nothing to insure against, nothing to plan my way out of. Money had trained me to think in solutions. This required something else entirely. At first, I assumed the feeling would pass. I told myself it was a phase, something people experience when life becomes quieter, when goals are no longer urgent. I filled the days the way I always had, staying organized, staying informed, staying ahead of small inconveniences. I maintained control. Control had always worked before. But the feeling didn't leave. It grew subtler instead, less noticeable, more embedded. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was a sense of distance between me and my own life, as if I were observing it rather than inhabiting it. I began to notice how carefully I avoided anything that didn't serve a clear purpose. Conversations that wandered, moments that lingered, feelings that didn't lead anywhere productive. I had spent decades training myself to value what was useful, measurable, efficient, and now that everything was stable, I didn't know how to value what couldn't be justified. If I were young again, I'd understand how easily financial thinking can spill into emotional life. How you begin to ask whether something is worth it instead of whether it's meaningful. How you start managing experiences the same way you manage assets, minimizing risk, maximizing return. I realized I had done that with people too. I hadn't neglected them outright. I showed up. I contributed. I helped when needed. But I rarely lingered. I rarely stayed long enough for conversations to deepen or silence to become comfortable. I kept things polite, contained, efficient. I told myself that was respect. In truth, it was distance. Money had given me independence, and independence slowly turned into insulation. I didn't need much from anyone anymore, and because I didn't need much, I didn't ask for much. That felt mature, self-sufficient. I wore it like a virtue. I didn't see how it limited intimacy. Real closeness requires a willingness to be unfinished, uncertain, a little exposed. I had structured my life to avoid exactly that. There were moments when I sensed how practiced I had become at staying composed. Even when something touched me emotionally, I noticed how quickly I explained it away. I told myself I was being realistic, balanced, not sentimental. I didn't realize I was editing my own responses before they had a chance to settle. Money hadn't made me cold. It had made me careful. And over time, careful became distant. I began to see how rarely I was surprised by my days. Everything followed a rhythm I had designed to avoid disruption, the same places, the same conversations, the same predictable comforts. Nothing challenged me emotionally, and I mistook that absence of challenge for peace. But peace doesn't feel hollow. If I were young again, I'd pay attention to what stops moving you, not what scares you, but what no longer reaches you at all. That's the quieter warning sign. I ignored it because it didn't feel urgent. It didn't hurt. It just flattened things slightly, day by day. I had achieved what I set out to achieve. Financially, I was secure. Practically, I was prepared. But internally, I felt underdeveloped, as if one part of me had matured fully, while another had been left waiting for permission to grow. I started to understand that money hadn't failed to save me from hardship. It had failed to save me from myself, from my tendency to prioritize safety over depth, control over connection, planning over presence. That realization didn't come with panic. It came with a quiet heaviness, a sense that something essential had been postponed for so long that I wasn't sure how to begin anymore. And for the first time, I wondered not how to fix it, but whether I had waited too long to notice. That question stayed with me, and once it did, it refused to be managed away. Once that question took root, it changed the way I moved through my days. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, something had shifted. I was no longer certain that stability was enough, and that uncertainty unsettled me more than any financial risk ever had. I tried to respond the only way I knew how, carefully. I didn't upend my life. I didn't chase anything impulsive. I simply began to notice. And noticing, I learned, can be deeply uncomfortable when you've spent decades avoiding it. I noticed how often I filled quiet moments automatically, reaching for information, reaching for tasks, reaching for anything that gave structure to time that otherwise felt exposed. I had always believed discipline was what kept life from unraveling. Now I began to see how it also kept me from feeling fully present. Money had taught me how to prepare for the future. It hadn't taught me how to inhabit the present. I started paying attention to my reactions instead of smoothing them over. When something stirred sadness, I didn't rush to explain it away. When something brought joy, I tried not to move past it too quickly. This was harder than I expected. My instincts pulled me toward control, toward balance, toward staying even. If I were young again, I'd understand how foreign feeling can become when you've spent your life managing outcomes instead of experiences. I also began to see how much of my identity was built around being self-contained. I rarely needed help. I rarely leaned on anyone. That independence had once felt empowering. Now it felt isolating. I didn't know how to let others in without feeling exposed. Money had given me the ability to solve problems alone, and I had mistaken that for strength. There were moments when I sensed grief, not for something specific, but for a way of living I had never fully practiced. A grief for conversations I kept efficient, for moments I left early, for feelings I postponed because they didn't seem practical at the time. I didn't blame money itself. That would have been easy. The truth was more complicated. Money had given me options. I was the one who consistently chose the safest ones, over and over again, not out of fear but out of habit. I had built a life that minimized risk, and in doing so, I had also minimized openness. I saw now that openness doesn't guarantee pain, but avoiding it guarantees distance. And distance, sustained over decades, becomes its own kind of loss. I began to understand why the emptiness I felt wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, because nothing had been taken from me. I had simply never stepped fully into what was offered. Money had protected me from scarcity, but it had also allowed me to bypass vulnerability. If I were young again, I'd know that vulnerability isn't the opposite of security. It's the cost of meaning. The more I noticed, the clearer it became that my life had been organized around prevention rather than participation. I had prepared for emergencies that never came, while quietly passing by moments that did. The irony of that realization stayed with me. I didn't suddenly become fearless or emotionally open. Change didn't work that way at my age. But I did become more honest about what I had traded away, without ever making a conscious decision. Honest about the fact that money hadn't saved me from this quiet erosion, it had made it easier to ignore. That honesty didn't fix everything, but it softened something inside me. It allowed a small space where reflection could exist without being immediately corrected or justified. And in that space, I began to see the full shape of the mistake, not as a failure of ambition or effort, but as a misunderstanding of what safety is meant to serve. Safety is supposed to support living, not replace it. I was beginning to understand that far later than I would have liked. But understanding, even late, still matters. And it would lead me to the hardest realization yet: what money had cost me in time. When I began to see what money had cost me in time, it didn't arrive as regret all at once. It came as awareness, slow, steady, impossible to dismiss once it settled in. I started to notice how much of my life had been spent preparing for moments instead of inhabiting them. I had always believed time was something you managed well or poorly. I tracked it, protected it, optimized it. I thought of wasted time the way I thought of wasted money, as a failure of discipline. That belief served me professionally. It did not serve me personally. Money had taught me to think long-term, and long-term thinking quietly pulled me out of the present. I was always leaning forward toward future security, future ease, future permission to relax. I didn't realize how often that lean caused me to miss what was already there. If I were young again, I'd understand that time doesn't accumulate the way money does. You can't save it for later. You can only spend it where you are. I spent mine carefully, but rarely deeply. Looking back, I see how many moments I rushed through because they didn't feel essential. Conversations that could have slowed, evenings that could have stretched, feelings that wanted space. I treated them like small expenses I didn't need to justify. Over time, those small dismissals added up. I had always told myself I was being responsible with my time. Now I see that I was being cautious with it. And caution, when practiced too consistently, becomes avoidance. There were people in my life who would have stayed longer with me if I had let them. Not because they needed me, but because presence invites presence. I didn't invite it often. I was polite, available, helpful, but I rarely lingered. I was always aware of the next obligation, the next task, the next reason to move on. Money made it easy to believe that efficiency was a virtue everywhere, that moving quickly through experiences meant I was respecting my time. I didn't see how speed thins experience, how slowing down is often the only way moments gain weight. I began to notice how time felt faster as I aged, not just because years passed more quickly, but because fewer moments stood out. Days blended together, weeks disappeared without leaving much behind. I told myself that was natural. Everyone says time speeds up as you get older. But time speeds up when nothing anchors it. If I were young again, I'd pay attention to what makes a day memorable, not just productive. Productivity fills schedules. Meaning fills memory. I had filled plenty of schedules. I also saw how often I delayed joy. Not intentionally, but habitually. I told myself I would enjoy things once everything else was handled, once work slowed, once responsibilities eased, once the future felt secure enough. That moment kept moving. I didn't realize that joy doesn't arrive at the end of preparation. It happens during participation. It happens when you stay instead of move on, when you let something matter without needing a reason. Money had given me the illusion that I could control timing, that I could decide when life would fully begin. In truth, life had been offering itself continuously, I just hadn't been present enough to receive it. This realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with tears or panic. It came with a quiet heaviness, a recognition that while I had avoided many hardships, I had also avoided depth. And depth is what gives time its shape. I don't regret being careful. I regret believing that careful living would automatically become meaningful living. It doesn't. Meaning requires attention, and attention requires time you're willing to give, without asking what you'll get in return. I had spent my time wisely by most standards. I just hadn't spent enough of it fully. That truth settled slowly, and once it did, it changed how I understood everything that followed. That truth about time, about attention, was the point where the story finally closed in on itself. There was nowhere left to defer understanding, no future version of me to hand it off to. I was 81 years old, financially secure, practically stable, and completely out of excuses. Life had slowed me down without asking for permission. The calendar thinned, obligations fell away, the structures I had relied on to organize my days loosened, and for the first time since early adulthood, there was nothing urgent left to manage. No financial pressure, no looming responsibility, no reason to stay in constant motion. I thought this would feel like relief. Instead, it felt like exposure. Without the framework of productivity and planning, I was left alone with my inner life, the one I had postponed engaging with for decades. I expected it to feel familiar. It didn't. It felt underdeveloped, like a muscle I had never fully used. I didn't know how to sit with my own thoughts without trying to improve them. I didn't know how to experience a moment without assessing it. Money had given me freedom from many fears. It had not given me fluency with myself. I began to see the full shape of the mistake then, not as a single wrong decision, but as a lifelong pattern. I had treated money as protection, and in doing so, I had treated life as something that needed guarding rather than entering. I had waited for safety to give me permission to be present. Permission never came. The hardest realization wasn't that money couldn't save me, it was that I had asked it to do a job it was never meant to do. Money can prevent certain losses. It cannot create meaning. It can reduce stress. It cannot deepen experience. It can buy time. It cannot teach you how to inhabit it. Looking back, I don't see a life ruined. I see a life thinned, carefully organized, well protected, respectable, and quietly distant from itself. I didn't miss everything. There were good years, good moments, people I loved, work I'm proud of. This isn't a story of bitterness. It's a story of misplacement, of putting faith in the wrong tool. If I could speak to my younger self now, I wouldn't tell him to stop saving or planning. That would be foolish. I would tell him something simpler and much harder to practice. Don't let security become the place where you hide from yourself. Don't assume that once you're safe, you'll automatically know how to live. Living is a skill. Presence is a habit. And like all habits, it must be practiced before you think you need it. I would tell him that money should support your life, not delay it. That stillness isn't laziness. That depth requires inefficiency. That some of the most important moments arrive without warning and leave quickly if you don't stay. I would tell him that being prepared for the future means very little if you never arrive fully in the present. I spent years believing I was doing the responsible thing, and in many ways I was. But responsibility without reflection quietly becomes avoidance, and avoidance, sustained over a lifetime, becomes loss. Money didn't save me from that loss. Nothing external could have. Only attention could have. Only presence. Only the willingness to stop and feel what was happening, instead of constantly preparing for what came next. I learned that late, too late to redo much, but not too late to name it honestly. If you're younger and listening, don't wait for stability to give you permission to live. Don't assume that once you're secure, meaning will follow automatically. It won't. Meaning comes from staying, from listening, from letting moments touch you without asking what they're worth. I built a secure life. I just didn't always live inside it. And that is the thing money never saved me from.